we can get started and give Shawn a couple minutes to orient and get things ready to share, and I'll just kick things off. So hi, I'm Christine Kirkpatrick. I'm here along with Chris Erdman and Alex Andro representing Go Fair US. For those of you who haven't heard about Go Fair US, just a couple quick slides. It's an international collaboration of folks who are all interested in the implementation of FAIR and finding practical ways to translate the FAIR principles into action. We do this along 3 pillars, which works on the change part, the culture, the policy, the training side, building up capacity, and then also the technology side and that whole services and systems ecosystem. And these are all done in collaboration with an international support and coordination office. But there are several national offices around the world, of course, many in Europe where there's a ton more funding to do things in FAIR. But we also have some efforts in South America, and then we're anchoring it in the US. And even though that DOD is in California, this effort is taking place all around the US. Some of the basics about the Go Fair approach, we use models like metadata for machines workshops to help orient people into some of the principles around making metadata fair and jumping right in, especially for domain-specific applications. This is in service of creating a FAIR implementation profile that gives you a nano publication and a way to communicate about how you've implemented FAIR on a project or in a domain. And this concept of putting your data on a FAIR data point, or at least the metadata about the data, so that it can be visited rather than the arduous approach of trying to gather everything and put it in a lake. This is our Go Fair US office team. We're sprinkled around the country. We come from NSF funding backgrounds, DOE funding backgrounds, and NIH. We're organized along the 3 pillars, but we do things a little bit differently in that we've also added an ambassadors pillar, understanding the big gap that's needed for consultants and people to help out in industry and across all the different sectors. And then we also have a close partnership with FairPoints that is very active and actionable, chunked up bites of information that you can use. And honestly is also the way that a lot of our early career people are included. So if you haven't checked out FairPoints, I encourage you to, and we'll put a link in the chat. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris Erdman to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, actually one of the people from FairPoints is on. So Donnie, if you could share the link, but I saw Donnie on the call, yeah, I just wanted to introduce our speaker. So Shawn Ross and RAiD. I actually work with Shawn on the RAiD project. I'm on the advisory group, and it's really starting to pick up steam, and they're building up the effort. So it's great to have Shawn, who's sort of leading that effort with RAiD. He's there with the team, of course. Yeah, I think at our recent meeting, it was clear that there was a need to do more outreach engagement around RAiD as it started ramping up, and particularly in the US as well. Although I think we're joined, just in the sort of North America region, but we're joined by others from around the world, I know. So in general, I think it's good to get updated on RAiD. And so without further ado, Shawn, if you're ready, if you have your slides prepared.
Yeah, I've got them.
Okay.
So, hi, everyone. Sorry, it's early here, and I'm not really a morning person. But we'll see how I'll. So if I start rambling, that's probably why. There we go. Hopefully that has worked.
Looks perfect.
Okay, yeah, great. Now I'm just moving my controls so I can see what's going on. All right. Well, thank you for coming today. what I thought I would do is, and this is luxurious. I usually am given sort of 10 minutes in a, in a panel of some sort to present RAiD. So having some more time, both for the presentation and maybe for some questions and answers afterwards, is a luxury. What I thought I'd do is go through and do an overview of RAiD first. And then I've got an example of RAiD and some of the benefits it would have offered to a project that I've been on for a while. I'm an archaeologist and historian, ancient historian by training. And then Chris also had sort of an example of RAiD, of potential RAiD benefits that I think he would like to speak to. So to just get started, RAiD is a relatively new identifier. It was proposed some years ago, but then kind of stalled for a while. And I was hired about 10 months ago to really get it going again. So RAiD is a persistent identifier for projects and activities. We're right now being not very prescriptive about how we're defining a project or activity. To a great extent, we want to allow people some space to see how they will use it. But we have found, although the precise definition of a project varies from one discipline to the next, or one part of the world to the next, that at least colloquially, most people, and I've even, now I'll go in to the Faculty of Arts at Macquarie University, where I'm based. I'm on a secondment to the ARDC. And I'll listen to the historians talking about what they're working on, and just at least colloquially, they'll say, what project are you working on now? And so even, in arts, humanities, social sciences disciplines, it's a concept that means something to people. And what we're really aiming to do with RAiD, and I'll go into more detail about this later, so I won't belabor the point now, is really looking at tying together all of the inputs, outputs, people, organizations, etc., that are connected to a project. And also provide some key information about that project that you can't find anywhere else, without duplicating information that already exists in other PIDs. About a few months ago, we had our ISO standard approved. A link to the description is here if you'd like to go take a look at that. We've had a bit more, I don't know, when we talk to people, it may be hard to define exactly what a research project is, but we've been able to say, well, at least we can say what it's not to a great extent, and that's mostly things that already have another identifier, grants, researchers, documents, etc. Also projects, organizational units, teams, centers, groups, departments, those sorts of that we grant projects as the sort of ad hoc grouping of people and resources where most research takes place. Understanding that in a lot of disciplines it'll be individuals rather than groups. So no software, data sets, instruments, samples, things like that. The only two of these that cause some confusion in some settings is, where do we draw the line between teams and groups and projects, and just as working definitions around some of these things. A team is more a group of people, whereas a project has an aim. It's got a specific outcome that's in mind, or object of study, rather than just being a group of people who are organized to do different things, or may work on different things. So there's some overlap there, and there's some gray area. We think in practice this will sort itself out over time, and we want to give people some space to see how they use it. And then the other thing is grants. That in some disciplines, grants are very closely identified with project. In other disciplines, on my side of campus, there's not so much confusion because a lot of research happens without any external funding. Or like in archaeology, a large archaeology project may go for years and have many grants over time. But I'd say, yeah, those are probably the two areas, the only two areas where we get very much confusion over how a RAiD should be applied. So how does RAiD work? Not dissimilar from some other identifiers. In the details, it has some aspects of a DOI and some aspects, say a cross-ref or data site DOI, and some aspects of an ORCID. That this presentation is long enough, I may subject you to a little bit of that. But the bigger picture first. So RAiD's got two parts: the identifier and the metadata record. We use it's built on the handle system. We are in the late stages. I wish I could sort of make a broader announcement about this, but we're not quite there yet. But we are talking to the DOI Foundation. So it will ultimately be based on the handle system, whether that's via a DOI or not. It is increasingly likely that we're going to be able to work something out to become a registration agency for the DOI Foundation and use DOIs for RAiDs, which will assist us as we integrate with the rest of the PID landscape. So we've got an identifier. And then we've got the metadata record behind it that mostly consists of PIDs for other project inputs and outputs: people, collaborators, organization, grants, awards, investments, infrastructure, tools, and services, data software, and then outputs like, well, data software could be an output or an input, publications, reports, and events, and we'll see if we have to back off a little bit when we get these into practice, but we're taking a pretty aggressive approach about saying, if you want to add a person to a RAiD, they've got to have an ORCID. And that hasn't proven to be too much of a barrier so far with our early adopters. A little bit of grumbling, but we've decided to hold the line and use this as an opportunity to get, these are discussions with organizations, mostly get them to use adoption of RAiD as a way to drive use of ORCID. Organizations are it's a little harder to get a ROR, it takes more time. So, and not all organizations have them. So at least in the short term, we're looking at using tax identification numbers or something else as at least an interim PID for organizations that don't have RORs until those get a little bit more widespread. But I won't go through each one of the different identifiers, but the idea is that that we use a PID, absolutely wherever possible, and perhaps apply a little pressure to get PIDs where people in particular don't have them yet, and we try not to duplicate any record that's in another ORCID. Like we're not saving, your name. It's in the ORCID. We'll get that information from ORCID. We may cache it to improve performance if that proves an issue, but we're not duplicating things out of these other identifiers into the RAiD metadata record. And then finally, the last thing we get is some fundamental information about the project that's not that you can't easily find somewhere else. And this is really things like title, start date, end date, if there is one, subject, description, though a few things like that. As an archaeologist, I snuck in and got through a geographic extent of a project. I haven't gotten a chronology yet, but maybe someday. Like a chronological extent of the research. That these are things to help discovery of other projects. This is sort of a model of what a RAiD is going to look like. We got RAiD.org, so we'll use a proxy sort of there to resolve at RAiD.org. And then, it's got, as I said, a few things about the project itself, titles, and you can have multiple titles, you can have past titles, you can have different kinds of descriptions, long description, short description, abstract, a few others. In multiple investigators, we use the credit ontology for role. We also allow you to define a position that's not a role is what you actually do or contribute to a project. We also have something for position that's more of your administrative position on a project, organizations, grants, articles, etc., samples with IGSNs. And importantly, I always use this slide to jog my memory about it, or I'll forget, especially this early. Sub-projects or related projects. We can relate RAiDs to one another, either to produce hierarchies or if one project supersedes another, and we use a subset of the data site control vocabulary for qualifying that relationship between RAiDs. We've used as much as we can in the RAiD record is governed by controlled lists, controlled vocabularies that we have attempted to not invent ourselves wherever we can. Where nothing really existed that worked for the lists that we wanted, we've tried to sort of truncate other lists or combine them, and we're going to publish those as proper vocabularies on Research Vocabularies Australia, so that to make interaction with the whole system a little easier. So why are we looking at doing a project ID? Building a persistent identifier is expensive, time-consuming, entailed in a lot of ways. So why do it? So one of the things in the, as we've been going around talking to people, even the work that the ARDC did before I joined it, is this idea that projects are really where research happens, whether it's collaborative as it is in a lot of disciplines, or it's sole researchers as it is in other disciplines. And again, at least in a colloquial sense, people talk about what project they're working on. And we really see this as where the research happens. It's research. You can't get quite a full picture of what's going on just looking at the people or organizations, but this time limited but identifiable and meaningful sort of ad hoc grouping of people, resources, inputs, outputs, this container is a meaningful thing. Second, there was initially some talk about, well, we could just use grant IDs, but as I've mentioned before, this isn't one-to-one. Some projects never have grants, others have multiple grants. And the other thing is, when I talk to funders about this, one of the problems that they have is that, sure, it's great that grants can get a grant ID. I was talking to someone at the Australian Research Council not long ago, and giving them the example of an ARC grant that I held from 2009 to 2011, and their reporting in window ended in halfway through 2012 or something like that, 18 months later, and they don't have even, we declared the grant on as funding on all the relevant papers, but it's not trivial for them, and they don't have a routine or automated way to find out that most of the high impact outcomes of what they funded then, are the field report. The book on the project came out in 2018. We've got a high impact paper that's just been accepted at a prestigious journal recently. That the ARC has no way of knowing that those things, although they may not be solely the result of that ARC funding, that ARC funding was crucial, and these things wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for that funding, even though it was 12 or more 15 years ago. So capturing longer term outputs, incomes, outcomes, impacts, since projects may produce those kinds of outcomes for a long time. Another thing is that other identifiers don't seem to work quite right for projects. Because again, there's some talk at the beginning. You try to talk yourself out of it if you want to propose a new PID. So why can't people, so maybe we can't just rely on grant IDs, cross-reference grant IDs or whatever, but maybe we could just use DOIs. And I've spoken with some people, Eric Olson and others at the Open Science Framework, Center for Open Science. And one of the things that they raised, and others as well, I'm using them as an example, is that if they put a DOI on a project, it's a snapshot, it's a one-off thing, but projects evolve, people come and go, organizations join and leave, and it would be better to have a PID with a metadata record that can evolve, and that's how we've designed it. That you don't get a new RAiD when a contributor leaves the project. You just change the contributor, or when a contributor's role changes, when a new publication comes out, when something happens to the project, you just make that change, and that change is recorded as part of the RAiD. The RAiD gives you a project history. And I think that's important to capture the evolving nature of the project. It also is, I think, an important piece of provenance information about if you get your hands on a data set that the project produced in 2015, you can see the people, organizations, instruments, resources, etc., that project was utilizing in 2015. So, for those reasons, we didn't think existing identifiers worked. And the last sort of compelling sort of reason here was that we thought that there were pathways to, getting from where we are to implementing RAiDs that go with the grain of the way that research is administered now. That a project, although it's not sort of in some cases a perfect fit for RAiD because of the ambiguity between projects and funding, but there's generally a concept of a project in research information systems. The concept of a project appears in schemas, etc., that are related to other PIDs. And project level metadata is specified in domain specific metadata standards. So again, in archaeology, we don't agree on very much. The standards are few and far between. Where sort of classic example of Borgman's sort of small data stuff where we're not very well standardized or organized in any way. But all that aside, one thing that the major domain specific repositories in archaeology do is ask for project level metadata. So for those, we thought that it fit into existing ways of administering projects that would help drive or at least make adoption somewhat easier. All right, so this is a bit of a illustration of what we're hoping to do. That right now, organizations, instruments, researchers, software, publications, grants, data, they can get identifiers. They can be identified in isolation. They may even point to one another. Find Your ORCID points to to publications that you've produced, but it's still, as I talked to our partners at EOSC, for example, it's quite that's the European Open Science Cloud, our European partners there. It's actually quite difficult to get a picture of the inputs and outputs that are related to a particular project. And they're talking about how we can go through, we can analyze everything with machine learning, and we can assert that there's a project, but it's a little, I don't know, we're not sure this is going to work, and it's complicated. And so we thought that, that the easiest thing to do is to actually declare these things, to have an identifier for a project. And one of our goals here is that hopefully, since a project is already a concept in a lot of research information systems, that people won't be building the information about their RAiDs from scratch. I mean, in a worst case scenario, at least they only have to do it once, not in each research information system for each university that is contributing to a project. But in many situations, they'll already have put a lot of this information into a system somewhere, and hopefully we can grab that through our API or through an integration using our API. But the idea here is that the project becomes the hub that ties together in a meaningful way the inputs and outputs associated with a research undertaking. So where are we now? This is next couple of slides are a little bit about where we're at, what we're doing. We've got our ISO certification. That took a while. We've redeveloped. There was an initial sort of pilot service that the ARDC had stood up some years ago that didn't really have a fully developed metadata record. Some other things. We've retired that. We've rebuilt it. Retired the old system, and we're building the new system now. Sort of building it well. We're just about mature enough now to start bringing on more sort of pilot users. We've got the new metadata schema it's either completely implemented or we've got just a couple of things left. I need to check with the developers to see if they've got the final details, which are mostly things like all the major elements are there now. It's things like any field that's a free text field, we're attaching a language code to it. It's details like that, but we're very close with the new metadata schema. And turning to working on landing pages. I guess I will, this is a long presentation. I'll explain a couple of decisions, architectural decisions that we've taken that I think are relevant. When you use RAiD, it's going to look a lot like you're using ORCID. We've came very early to the decision that and there was broad consensus. I was surprised how easy this argument was to win. The RAiDs are going to have a standardized landing page. That they're not just going to redirect to a resource somewhere. That there's going to be a standardized landing page, resolvable at RAiD.org, that gives you the basic information about a project and a single API endpoint for reading that information. Behind the scenes, though, RAiD is it's a federated system. There'll be registration agencies around the world, RAiD registration agencies under the auspices of and policies that are developed by the ARDC as the global registration authority in the ISO, but there'll be different registration agencies and each will run a RAiD service. And if you want to write and edit and do that sort of thing, you're working through the registration agency that you're associated with. But there's a single point but that information gets we don't copy the information to a central location, but it's federated so that a search or a resolution will work across all of the agencies. So we've tried to combine the advantages of a distributed system like that. That it's less expensive for any entity to run than a centralized system. It's more resilient. There are a number of advantages to doing it. That it allows. We want to give registration agencies some scope to, for example, extend the metadata record with locally relevant metadata, and we've already got quite a bit of interest in doing that, and do some other, develop their own business models, and do some other things specific to their own communities. And we see that it's likely that registration agencies, some will be geographically based, although we're not giving sort of exclusive rights to Europe or North America or whatever, but some are geographically focused and some are focused on communities or organizations or whatever that are within those regions. So we're working on these landing pages and the global resolution service at the same time that we're working on the software that registration agencies will use. It's also looking likely that so far the potential registration agencies we're talking to want to reuse the software we're building rather than building their own to a specification. So we're working with some of the early likely registration agencies, particularly SURF in the Netherlands, to achieve that redeployability goal. Working on the UI integration with other PIDs, so that if you're building a RAiD record, you can look up ORCIDs and other PIDs in a logical way, and you're not typing anything in, no free text, we don't be typing stuff in if it can be looked up. We're also working on policy and governance in parallel with this. We're a small team, so this is taking some time, but we're working through that, and we're getting ready to hire a community manager to work on outreach and engagement and uptake, and bringing universities or other organizations on as early as early adopters of this to see what we've done wrong and what needs to be changed before it goes out into wider circulation. So that's sort of a overview of what we're doing. So why should you do this? What are the benefits as we see them of using a RAiD? Single source of truth reduces double entry of data. This idea that if you're getting a project going and you're thinking about applying, say you're applying for your first grant, the way that it generally happens, at least in Australia these days, and I don't think this is vastly different, is that at each organization that's involved, you build up a record in your local research information system, and everyone's adding all of the contributors and their affiliations and all of this. And that work happens at 3, 4, 5, universities or other organizations. So there's a lot of double entry of data. In a lot of cases, even within a university, whether the research information system is tied to the finance system, or whether you have to enter a bunch of information twice there, is hit or miss. So it reduces this double entry and also ensures coordination across organizations. I've seen grants fail, like administrative checks, like be just disqualified because not all the big ones like infrastructure grants where the organizations don't quite have things coordinated across them, and an error occurs. Somebody being involved with more grants than the scheme allows or something like that, because information wasn't coordinated across all the organizations involved. So there's a hope here that this saves time on administration and reporting, and I'll say a bit more about that in the next slide. So you've got efficiency and consistency around a single source of truth, supporting reporting and impact measurements, that it should facilitate tracking and reporting of inputs and outputs, and give a bigger picture or broader picture than what an ORCID record is going to do, or a grant, Crossref grant ID is going to be able to give you, because the reporting windows for grants are limited in duration, and ORCID, like if you looked at my ORCID, it tells you a lot of things, but I'm involved in some very I don't know, I think they're related, but some distinct strands of research, some field archaeology, some that's more around digital approaches and meta science and that kind of thing, that you don't really get a good picture of what would, there's a list of grants and there's a list of publications, but it's not entirely clear what's related to what. So it gives support, facilitates tracking and reporting of inputs and outputs over the long term. And we can also capture non-traditional research outputs, or other things like policy papers, or other aspects of impact that can collect evidence for that impact that's used in say research excellence exercises and stuff like that. We should, with everything machine readable, linked to the other, in an ideal world, linked to the other PIDs, that kind of thing, should support tools for analysis. Similar to the way that bibliometric research is done, we're hoping we can, open this up to really doing research on the networks that produce research, comparisons of what kinds of inputs lead to what kinds of outputs, to see patterns there and things like that, and facilitate decision making. So reporting impact, not those sorts of things. For me, one of the important things is capturing research provenance. That I think the evolution and history of a project, which is context that the research takes place in, is a really important piece of metadata, paradata about the outputs of a project, like data sets. So I think being able to see that history and view what a project consisted of at a single point of time is a really powerful thing to look at the origins of the outputs of that project. You can also create timelines from it. I've dreams about things like, automatically, interacting with OSF to populate RAiDs and populate their project information, generating, simple sort of static websites for projects that are, out of the record that's in the metadata record in a RAiD. I think there's a lot of things that you could do with that information, and to get beyond what, like all the projects I'm on, people have Word documents. We use Confluence in one of our projects, and there's always a page of key project information that we always have to look up. And think if we could get that in one place, it would be a great benefit. And there's also finally standardizes project identification for other purposes that we haven't thought of yet, and governed by an ISO standard, and with an organization, with the ARDC backing this, and the support of the other major PIDs. So benefits, just very quickly, so the luxury of time, I can go on more than I thought I could. Let me quickly give you this is based on a cost-benefit analysis done by MoreBrains, that's available at the link at the bottom of the slide, and I'm happy to share this presentation. Estimate, this was an estimate for Australia, and that figured that there are about 21,000 projects in Australia. If you scale this based on, and I think the original number actually came from the UK, and then they scaled it on relative research investment. And if the number of projects per research investment dollar, as reported by the OECD, is if that relationship holds, there's about 1.5 million projects in any given year in the OECD, about 625,000 in the US, and you can see the figures for the UK and Australia. The balance is primarily from Europe. And in their report, they calculated that if we could eliminate double entry of project metadata, and they did this by surveys of research support units in universities, libraries, and research services, and these sorts of units within an organization, that it'd save about just under 3,000 person days a year at a cost of a little under $3 million a year. But your real payoff came when you combined it with ensuring that other things that can be captured with a PID, publications and grants in particular, that you get over 10 times that that savings in person days, and close to 10 times in dollars. So significant efficiency gains, and now what we thought we'd do is I've got a bit of an example from my my work, what our problems were that we had that a RAiD could help address, and then Chris has a couple of slides, and then we'll save some time for questions. So for my example, I'm using this archaeology project I've referred to a couple of times, that is in central and southeast Bulgaria, landscape archaeology project. We do field survey, like line up us and students and count pot shards, and get a picture of settlement patterns over a large area. This had many organizations and participants internationally, across different universities in Australia and internationally. Not every year since 2008, but in most years we've run at least one field season. In some years we've run two, most years one, and it's still going on. There was a field season last year. I did a quick count of the organizations involved and which ones have research information systems, and we figured that the project information has been entered into at least 5 research information systems by hand, and it's got a lot of organizations and participants and a growing list of publications, etc., and all that information had to be some of the publications might have been captured automatically once records were established and people's records were tied in and that kind of thing, but much of this had to be entered manually in each organization. We went through 4 major grant applications, some successful, some not, and then a number. I didn't bother counting all of the smaller, one-off sort of grants for specific things like carbon dating or something like that. But each time one of these major grants happened, a lot of information had to be entered again and again into each application. We had over time about 30 researchers and 120 volunteers have worked on the project. That's a lot of work to keep track of, at least for the research, even if you only count the researchers. And out of those 4 grant applications, we won 3 of them, but most of those big grants came from 2008 to 2011. And the reporting windows generally close within 18 to 24 months. And how do those funders know about the book that was published, the Quaternary Science Review article in 2013, a book that came out in 2018, and we just got provisional acceptance as part of a larger paper that's a genetic study across Europe that's coming out this year in a high impact journal. We hope when the final rough edges are sanded off. How do they know about about these things? What if you want to know about the history of the project? We've got a website. We've got an OSF page. They're both manually updated. I'm sure they're out of date and out of sync with one another. So it would be somewhat, even though we published the history of the project in words in the 2018 book, but it's a bit hard to grasp what the history of the project is. So if we had a RAiD, we'd have a single point of truth for the project information. I'd probably give each field season a sub RAiD relating to one another so that we could capture the differences between the volunteers, et cetera, that were on each seat, but still be able to amalgamate that information. I'm hoping that RAiD would eliminate a lot of the data reentry and connect the grants people's organizations in a much better way. So in the efficiency and coordination, allow us to track long-term impacts and make the history of the project, the provenance of all the outputs of the project a lot more accessible. If anyone wants to, this is part of our commitment to making our research as open as we can. We publish our data sets. To my embarrassment, I've not got them all published yet. I'm still cleaning a couple, but we're publishing data set. And this is, we publish the software that we use. We use open source software. We publish that. And when we've created it, and this is a piece of that open scholarship to me, to give others an insight into what the history of the project is. So that's me. You've heard me talk enough, and I need to work on my coffee a little bit more. So I'm going to turn over to Chris now. And Chris, I can just keep, if you tell me to advance the slide, I'll advance the slide.
Yeah.
And,
I was thinking, so yeah, I wanted to apologize. I've forgotten how early it is, and I think I've eaten into my brownie points with you. But thank you for getting up at 6 a.m. your time. Yeah, so I'm Chris Erdman. I'm at, I didn't properly introduce myself, but I'm at the Michael J. Fox Foundation and also the Learning Science across Parkinson's. And I work on Open Science, both funders. And actually joined, I don't know if she's still on the call, but Ivana Sosa was someone who worked with me on like looking at what RAiD meant to the fund from the funder perspective. But just to start, I think you just wanted to briefly say that I think RAiD really represents kind of a new way to, like, I think Shawn actually mentioned this earlier, is that it really helps with greater understanding from a funder's perspective about all the sort of research outputs. Right now, it's very hard for us to wrangle them and get it, have this sort of overarching picture of what's happening. And I think, that's the promise of RAiD that I think will help us. And I brought up one example from ASAP, which is our catalog. So right now, we're just listing our outputs. ASAP is one of these forward-looking places for requiring all these different outputs from researchers. So not encouraging, but requiring for funding. So currently we list all these outputs, but the promise is, and we're currently looking at redesigning our webpage and how we represent our research. But that it really does follow how how RAiD is structured, how to structure our research around a project. So I just wanted to mention that. And then next slide. Oh, backwards. Thanks, Shawn. And then this is the part that Ivana and I sort of worked on. And I think this is a question to Shawn, is that we found it really, although it's early days with RAiD, we're still kicking the tires, well, almost done. And you heard from Shawn of finalizing the schema and everything. But we used the spreadsheet that Shawn had created for us on the various fields that are involved that we should be thinking about. And it was really helpful for Ivana and I to walk through. And this is a picture of the software that we use for managing our grants called Smart Simple. And it allowed us to sort of look through the naming conventions, there versus, again, sort of crosswalking, looking at how it's named in RAiD, and also how to structure things. And so it's really helpful for us to think about how we can plan moving forward, because also ASAP, the software is used by Michael J. Fox Foundation, but it's also used by ASAP, the other funder. And so doing this will also help other funders, sort of responding to RAiD and preparing. But yeah, and then I just wanted to follow up too, that the ISO standard, we know that that's not, you have to pay for access, but if you want copies, at least I think there's some librarians on the call in North Carolina. I can distribute one copy to your library, at least for sharing the ISO standard. And also it's another question for Shawn of saying that PIDs, he actually had TBD for PIDs for instruments. And I think that's also maybe more farther along. Maybe you can talk about that too, because I know he was involved with it. But I know, Shawn, you have a lot of Q&A questions. So if you wanted to tackle those right now, but thank you again for waking up so early.
Thanks, Chris. It's good. I'll have a productive day, I'm sure, since I'm up and going. So
do you
Q&A, I see. Yes. Now I was just looking at yes. So let's see. First question is about Envision being able to embed a service request. Yes, about embedding into a repository. Where Figshares approached us to talk about this. Digital science seems quite interested. So yeah, and we're talking to OSF as well. The Australian Data Archive runs on Dataverse, and I know the director there quite well, and I'm sure Ed he's on the working group for Project PIDS as part of our national PID strategy. So I suspect this is something we'll be envisioning, that we'll be working on sooner rather than later. And we're building an API that should be able to facilitate integration with and it's largely it's getting more mature. So this should allow integration with not in the first instance we were thinking of research information systems, but I'd say the second thing on our list are repositories. So yes, I think that that's a valuable application for it. We are planning to do it, and we've begun talking to some of the key players at the general repositories. Let's see. Yes. How many people will be able to write to a project's RAiD? Delegate out as a that it is one of the things that we've found and that we've been learning more and more about in the last few months is how involved it is to handle roles and permissions for for RAiD, because unlike an ORCID fine, it's a person, and that person can delegate to trusted parties, and that's great. RAiDs are multi-party entities, so we have to manage access. We're working on a permissions model now. It is likely to work something like an organization or a lead or probably a lead contributor. We might not restrict it. A contributor to the project initiates a RAiD and then invites other people, and there'll be a mechanism for inviting and then those people assenting or to the invitation to add them, and then they'd have read write access. We hope and plan that most RAiDs will be open, but we've been in our requirements analysis, there's pretty widespread demand for the ability to embargo the information on a RAiD, the metadata on a RAiD. So we'll probably have a viewer of a closed RAiD role as well. But we're working on this, invitation and acceptance process now. We're modeling it on the way that some of the grant websites, work for, like when you apply for an Australian Research Council grant, how one person starts it, then they invite other people, everyone defines their roles, and you work on it from there. So yeah, it is involved, and I suspect we won't get it right the first time, but we're working on that kind of how you give permissions to people to write to it. So let's see, spawning sub projects, thousands or more PIDs of various outputs. The use of sub-project, we've got a couple of case studies around sub-projects, the biggest and most extreme one being the German climate change computing center. And they have an internal way that they organize projects and sub-projects that we are doing. We're not going to, this is something that we think we will eventually have something to say as far as a statement of good practice goes, but we're not going to prescribe. The technical system can handle, I forget how many, it can handle the sizes of metadata that we expect even in a large complex project. But Chris would like to say something about this one, so go ahead, Chris.
Oh no.
Oh, sorry, it just says Chris would like to answer this question, popped up on my screen. I don't know.
I was just saying I answered live, sorry.
Oh. Yeah. Okay, so and one of the things that the ways that this will, RAiD will always be hosted at a single registration agency. So if SURF in the Netherlands is the registration agency with the RAiD, and you're based in the US. We're working out a way where your ORCID can essentially be used as a passport across all of the registration agencies, and you won't you won't know this. This is what's going on behind the scenes, right? But the record is held in the RAiD service. But even if you're in Australia or North America, you'd be writing to that record, which you would get to from something like an edit button on the resolution page. So in fact, we are having those conversations right now about how, how does editing work when you have multiple registration people from different parts of the world or covered by different registration agencies involved. Some projects can be at a different registration agency. Yes, how to transfer stewardship. So yes, this is actually part of the metadata record is the owner of it, which is the organization that is sort of legally responsible for it, and that can be changed as part of the metadata record. Again, there is some discussion still being had about what happens if it moves from the University of Sydney to the University of Leiden. How do we move a RAiD from one registration agency to another, and how does that interact with the handle/DOI system? The fallback, if we can't think of anything better, is you make a new RAiD and it says this RAiD supersedes that or continues. We'll use the a controlled vocabulary from DataCite for that, but one would supersede another because we're still looking at what would be involved with moving a RAiD from one registration agency to another, but recreating it and then flagging that relationship is our fallback solution. Yes, append only, exactly. That's what metadata records are append only. The history of the project is maintained. We don't delete things. Unfortunately, I can't get you the ISO standard. I couldn't even get the members of our advisory group the ISO standard. I had to carry paper copies to Europe to hand around. It should be available at your local library. Is generally how you can do that. So it is difficult to distribute ISO standards, as we've found out.
I can at least give a copy to a local library.
Yeah.
If someone is interested. So.
And yeah, one off. I've got a few copies, but it's limited how many printouts we can get. Benefits of being under the DOI Foundation. I know we're nearly out of time. Is largely around it makes expanding RAiD easier because no one has to set up a new local handle server every time you want to set up a new RAiD service. The DOI Foundation, provides that as we, as RAiD grows. So there's a certain, assistance in growth that way. The main benefit is with the DOI's got a metadata kernel that's consistent across all the registration agencies, Crossref, DataCite, etc. And that allows you to do a certain amount of searching, retrieval, integration without ever having to resolve through to, in our case, the record in the RAiD service at the registration agencies. So our potential integrators, and we're already talking to DataCite, Crossref, and ORCID about the cool things that we could do with helping everyone keep their various identifiers up to date. All of the publications on a RAiD are reflected in Crossref, that Crossref and RAiD and ORCID and RAiD and DataCite and RAiD are all in sync with one another, and potentially the other PIDs are in sync with each other, using RAiD as hub, that we can do that a lot more easily with DOIs. And as far as institutions being members of RAiD, what we're looking to do now is set up registration agencies that cover, we need to find a North American registration agency. And we don't have it. SURF has committed. JISC in the UK is looking very likely. We've got a few other inquiries. but we haven't set one up. We don't have anything firm in North America, so we need to get the registration agencies set up. And then we work in the early phases. We're going to work with the idea of a service point at each university or in the case of something like OSF, they might have their own service point. Figshare or digital science might have their own service point, but there'll be that a user-facing service point in a library or research services, to help onboard people. Whether we keep that isn't inherent to the architecture of the system necessarily. To have service points, we'll see if that's a valuable thing as we roll out, and whether to keep it or not. But the key thing is we need to get people associated with a registration agency to use it. So we got to find one for North America, which will be one of the first things that our community manager is going to be working on. So, and I think that's the last of the questions.
That was it. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Shawn. Yeah, again, thanks for making it so early, and thanks for sticking around to answer all the questions. We'll be posting these slides and the recording on the Go Fair US site, also distributing, I guess, to the people that registered. We also send out a message to the people that registered with this information. But I just wanted to thank everyone for joining. And I posted a way to connect with us to stay engaged with Go Fair US, and Shawn is including his information right there. I shared the RAiD Twitter handle earlier. Yeah, Shawn, no one can see your they can see it in your slide deck, but I think you shared it with us, your email. And then
contact at actually, I see that it's this is still got the generic ARDC contact. We do have contact at RAiD.org
okay
now, so that's actually probably better.
Contact at RAiD.org. Okay.
Yeah.
That I will just repost that to everyone here. And also, if you're interested, we have other events. So one with Hugging Face coming up with machine learning librarian that's going to talk about making models more discoverable. So that's an exciting project, Hugging Face. And then also machine actionability event is actually tomorrow. So if you wanted to follow that link and register. But thanks again, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. Talk to you later. See you around out there in virtual land.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Get some sleep.